this week we read about voice. We also read about summary and scene. In this video, I'm going to talk about voice. So when you're writing fiction, or when you're really writing anything, your voice begins to emerge over time. You don't have to overthink, like, what is my writing voice? It literally is something that you develop over time as you write, or that just sort of comes to light as you write. So the first rule of talking about your voice is you don't talk about your voice. Now, the first rule of finding your voice is to maybe stop looking for it and just let it come. Some of the things that, some of the words that might be associated with voice, or how we would describe a writer's voice, would be what is the register that they typically write in, or what kind of imagery do they typically use, or some of the idiomatic expressions that, or just various sort of idiosyncrasies of theirs, right? These are things that begin to emerge in your own writing, your own patterns of representation, if you will, over time. So the best way to really find your voice is to write a lot, and to risk authenticity, right? Like, take the risk of being authentic, saying silly things, and shaking off sort of those people that you emulate because you don't know that your voice is good enough, right? Your voice is good enough, and it gets better, right, over time, the more you practice. So go ahead and maybe stop trying to write like someone else and start trying to find out what it means to write like you. And also remember that we all have different voices. We don't have just like one singular voice that we write in. So you can play with them, develop them. You might have a silly voice. You might have a very sophisticated voice. I know that, like, it's almost like how we code switch and we code mesh in our day-to-day lives. So you might have a home talk that is very different than how you talk at school, or how you talk at work, or how you talk to your grandparents versus your friends, right? So you want to think about your audience. Some things that develop your voice are, maybe increasing your vocabulary, reading more, things like that. Some of the key words that are associated with your voice as a writer include persona, right? So even if you're writing as yourself, it is the aspect of yourself that you choose to show that is your writing persona, right? So when you're writing, you might not always, obviously, that you have the opportunity to tidy it up and be fabulous, right? So you might not show those parts of you that are insecure, or you might have a very vulnerable writing voice. All of these things are fine. So to some extent, you're always writing in a persona, even if that persona is your writing persona. But sometimes you're writing in a persona that is very, very separate from your own, right? And that is when you sort of take on the characteristics in your voice of another character, say a boss, or an elf, or the embers of a fire as they are slowly dying and witnessing, maybe a couple talking about where their relationship is headed, or something like that, right? As you write in personas that are less and less like yourself, your goal, of course, is to become less detectable. Your ego sort of will disappear into the character from which you're writing, and the persona that you're taking on will emerge. Another aspect of voice, or how you write, the voice that you're writing from, that's important to think about is the point of view, right? The point of view is who's standing where in relation to what happens. Let me say that again. Basically, the point of view is who is standing where in relation to what happens. So how close is the narrative voice, the persona that's telling the story, to the action, and how close are they to the audience? Right? So we have first, second, and third person points of view that we're very familiar with. Now, our first person point of view could be from the role of a central character, right? In which case you're telling the main story, or you're telling the main plot points of the whole story through the first person experience of whoever the main character is in the story. Or you could have the first person perspective of a peripheral character, right? So that's a character who is kind of like maybe you're telling the story from the point of view of a sidekick, or you're telling the story from the point of view of like that kid at the lunch table that no one realizes sees everything because nobody really talks to him or her or them, right? Second person is something that you tend to avoid. Most fiction that's written in the second person is definitely pretty experimental because it breaks that fourth wall. Even though there's not necessarily a fourth wall on the page, it takes the narrator out of the book and directs their attention to the reader, and the reader becomes a character in the book, right? And so that can be super tricky. Like how are you going to, unless you're writing like a choose your own adventure or something, or you're suddenly asking, dear reader, what would you do? And there are those moments. They function in drama very much like asides. If you know what an aside is, that's where someone is going along and they're doing all of the action and they're like, oh, no, I'm having this dialogue with somebody else, and then they whoosh ask you a question, right? That's kind of how you would deploy second person, but most of the time we aren't using second person. So you have first person, where it can be from a central character or from a peripheral character. Second person, which we kind of avoid because it invites the reader to become a character in the story, and it's very difficult to navigate, right? And then third person. Now, third person kind of has three different ways we can go about it. Third person can be, and you may have learned this before. If you did, welcome to the review, right? Third person is he, she, her. You don't use I or you when you're writing. And you can either use third person omniscient, which is kind of like the God angle, right? The deity that knows everything, past, present, and future, can see into the minds of all of the characters, and they so the third person omniscient narrator knows everything, and can at any time use that information, and then the reader is privy to it. Whereas limited omniscient, which is what many people write from, that sort of is where you choose time, like, because the third person omniscient knows everything about time, space, the minds of all of the characters, where third person limited omniscient can dig into maybe one character's mind or two characters' mind, maybe knows a little bit about the past, doesn't really, they have a greater understanding than maybe first person, right? In terms of their perspective and what they can show the audience, but not as much as the third person omniscient. And then you have third person objective, which is basically they are just a witness, right? Just a witness. That the narrator of this story, which is you as the writer writing in third person limited, objective third person objective, you just are witnessing. That is it. You can't get inside anybody's heads. You only know what you know based on what you're seeing. And that's really it. Those are I think the big things that you need to know about voice. So this week we're going to play around a little with voice. Or this week in your writing, if you're not in my class and you're just randomly happening upon this video, why don't you play around with voice a little bit? Take a character, write about that character from various points of view. First, third limited, peripheral character, the central character, and see how it goes. Play around.